Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this latest edition of the Players NIL podcast. And my guest today, Paul Caccamo from South Philly and currently living on Cape Cod. Paul, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Mark, good to be here.
Well, I appreciate your time, and I'm very interested to hear about the things that you're working on and in some of your current projects. But we always start the podcast with a little history. So I asked this question of all of my guests, what is your relationship with sports as a youth, as a child, as a fan, as an athlete? Who was it that took you to your first game? Who were your childhood stars? Do you have a relationship with the sporting world? Tell us a little bit of background.
All right, Mark, you ready for this answer? I have very little relationship to sports throughout my life until my career. And okay. I have six brothers. My dad was a coach. He coached almost all, but I was just more focused in things like the underground newspaper and all kinds of organizing and other kinds of I would even say nerdy clubs more than sports. And it was kind of an irony in life that I ended up, I guess, running the only national service program that focuses on using sports to inspire the well-being of kids. It's an irony because everyone always thinks I always, when I'm meeting with a funder, they'll be like, oh, they'll tell me about their glory days playing high school lacrosse. And I actually don't have those experiences. I sit and I relate, and I'm like, I totally hear you. What a bummer that you didn't win the championship back in 1986. But I don't have that experience. I got into this field for an entirely different reason, which I think is relevant to the Players NIL in terms of one of your core principles around philanthropy. And we can get into that, but my pathway here is quite different than one would guess.
Okay, well, that's not the answer I expected, but it is the answer. So let's dive back into it. So what were those, experiences like? What were some of the life skills that you learned? What were some of the principles? What are some of the values that you got during that time that you've parlayed into what you're doing today?
So one of the things I learned, and this is part of my own sort of journey, was I became really involved in education. And and fortunately, I was lucky. I have two parents that were great. I mean, they cared about their kids. They exposed their kids to things. They have resources to help us go to a summer camp and learn different things. So I knew when I started to get involved in public education and public health, which I got my master's degree in those areas, those concentrations, I knew that for a lot of kids, I observed those life skills that you just mentioned. They can come in various ways. They can come from an arts program. They can come from a sports program. They can come from having six brothers, because we did play sports. Trust me, we would ice the driveway every time my parents went out and it was below 32 degrees, and they'd all come home and slip and fall, and we'd all be playing hockey on the ice. So we did play, organically. And I think you learn life skills from the more activities you get to participate in a kid, which then goes to my journey, which is in public health and public education, and specifically becoming a teacher. I realize how many kids don't get to participate in these, mainly because of economics, because they're growing up in a neighborhood of poverty, and they're just, if they're not hyper talented from the beginning and identified by a coach at the high school basketball level who's like, this kid's going to be a star from our high school, the rest of the kids don't have this exposure. And we know, everyone probably listening, I hope, that if you don't have exposure to sports or an equivalent, if you don't have the chance to be part of a team, like I said, with six brothers, we still played soccer in the backyard every night. If you don't have those opportunities, then you really don't, it's not about missing out on being an athlete. It's missing out on being successful in life, on a pathway of success. Because what do you learn? Leadership, teamwork. You learn how to manage stress, because sports can be very stressful, and you can translate that to managing it with your academic workload. All these kinds of skills. You learn plan B. One of the most important things that a lot of us take for granted. If something goes wrong this morning, our brain instantly helps us think of, how am I going to navigate around that? Well, what is the best way to practice that? It's sports. When the offense changes up, you change up on the defense instantly. That's plan B thinking. So these are the kinds of life skills that I think when we deny the opportunity for kids to play sports simply by defunding them in our public education systems, I think we're denying the opportunity for kids to be success stories on and off the field.
Wow. So there's a lot to unpack there. First of all, I have to share that my father was a junior high gym teacher, my mom an elementary school teacher. So I grew up in a family of educators. I have an education degree, although I never taught, but I've coached people and I have managed, to lead people through, coaching techniques, and maybe my genetics have played a part in that. I too believe that there are lots of ways to gain life skills and valuable experiences: art, math, science, travel, food, culture, today, fashion, entrepreneurial things. But I worry about the balance in youth sports today. And the balance is that the pendulum has swung so far to earlier, crazier, year round sports specialization. Before we get to that, though, help us understand your perspective. Tell us about your company and what you really do. What is your message?
Okay, so I am working in a school in New York City, in Washington, D.C. I've worked in a few different schools systems, and a kid is all of a sudden taken out by a cop in the middle of the school day, 20 years ago. And one little mistake, and it cost the kid their future. And I saw it. A kid doesn't show up the next day and completely disappears and drops out. So I was fascinated by not why did kids make these mistakes, because we see them, we know why they're making them. They're growing up usually in an unsupported situation, and that there aren't enough adults looking after them. They don't feel that anyone cares. So why not go and join the gang and drop out of school? So what I looked at, Mark, when I was in education was, why do kids stay in school? Why do kids make, from the same exact socioeconomic situation, why did they make the decision to show up every day? And when I start talking to kids, and this really changed my career. So this goes the add-on to our first question about my non-sports particular background, is when I talk to kids as an educator who were making the right decisions, I heard an answer that really struck me, and it stayed with me to this day, which is not all the kids, but a lot of kids who played sports said, I got to be in school tomorrow because of my coach. I got to pass my exams because of my coach. I got to be the first in my family to graduate because my coach thinks I can. And that pretty much took all that, complicated study of public policy and public health and turned it into a simple equation, which is that we need more coaches in kids' lives. They are probably one of the most influential, negative sometimes, but positive if we can train coaches,
Mhm.
or if they just naturally have that care and humanity to their coaching. But we need more coaches. And at the same time, I looked at the state of public education and saw that so many schools had cut their sports programs, or they only kept the championship football team or basketball team that gave them glory. But for the rest of the kids, 90% of the kids, and obviously I'm focused on low income, there was no opportunity to play sports. So what I did was I launched 15 years ago. I actually met the just retiring NFL commissioner, Paul Tagliabue, and who's a wonderful human being. And I told him I have this idea for a national service program in which, like Teach for America recruits teachers to work in schools, let's recruit young adults to be coaches. And let's train them to be the absolute best role model in kids' lives. And then let's place them in underserved communities, schools, parks, and nonprofits that need coaches in order to get kids off the street and in a safe environment every day. And of course, having the sports life skills experience. So that's what I do. It's called Up2Us Sports. And it is the only national service program funded federally and by several states across the country that recruits, trains, and supports coaches to be, I would say, the absolute best mentors in kids' lives.
At what level are these coaches coaching? Is it youth level, school level? Where are you focused?
Our coaches are coaching everywhere from age 6 to age 17.
Okay.
So it's all youth, but it is elementary, middle, and high school age young people.
All right. So then back to the question, the proliferation of youth sports, year-round specialization. What are you doing to address that? How do you address that? How do you view that?
Well, one, it's a danger because I come again from this absolute life skills perspective on sports. And once we start limiting the definition of what the athletic experience can be, we're limiting the life skills that come with it. And I think that that's the biggest challenge that I would say, communities where and families that have means for their kids to participate in, the sort of pressure that gets on kids, in those areas, we're definitely losing the message of sports. I mean, great athletes never talk about how much they were usually how much they were forced as kids. They talk about the positive experience it's had on their life, and I think we need to really focus on that. But that focus is my entire career, because when I train coaches, we train coaches on how do you maximize the sport experience? How do you expose kids? How do you start a practice by just having the kids show up and a bunch of soccer balls are on the ground? Don't even come up with a rule. Let the kids play for 10 minutes and just socialize. Like, how do you use times like team time afterwards to sit kids down and have some discussions as a team? I mean, there's so much valuable, rich experience in sports. How do you how do you have a kid coach from the sidelines instead of you coaching, so that a kid experiences what it's like to be coaching their team instead of just being out on that particular half? No, they're actually actively engaged and coach, like all these kinds of experiences. And I can go on with hundreds of them because there's so many that are built into the game, no matter what the game is. It's just we've gotten so much more focused on the outcome, which is competitive, get the trophies, get the scholarships, that we've lost the process. And I can tell you, and I can tell any family that has means that is focused on that outcome, come visit my programs where the kids are more under-resourced. They don't have a lot of programs, but watch how much they enjoy sports. Maybe sometimes compared to your kids under pressure, and they enjoy it. And some of them are equally talented athletes, but they're enjoying it because we're training these coaches and we're talking to these programs about a more life skills experience. And we're talking about the process. We're talking about exposure to different sports, different seasons. We're talking about using time where kids can build relationships and say, remember, a lot of kids drop out, they say, because it's not fun. Did you build in just that time where kids can have fun before we get into the skill building? We talk about how you point out to kids when they make a small accomplishment, a small skill, and say, look what you just did. Because some kids don't hear that message when they accomplish a basketball skill that they didn't have that day before. No one stops to say, you did it. Even that little accomplishment, and all that stuff leads to kids staying in the game. And so it's not unusual that so many kids are dropping out of sports with so much pressure tied to it.
Yeah, I love it. And I wonder though, in all candidness, is it idealistic or is it realistic? Right.
Isn't that the whole the whole point of life is some of us will always dream in idealism versus realism. And I will translate that because, again, I'm going to go back to the policy side of things, which I never really forgot. And so I'll bring it up right here. There's always going to be that conflict of idealism versus realism, and economics drives a lot of that, among other base reasons. But let's talk about how we can play the game then to get around that. And I believe, and this is the kind of work I'm doing right now, is I want to study whether or not, if we place trained coaches, and again, all of my coaches are trained throughout the year to be these kinds of mentors, and we place them in a high school that has, let's say, high dropout rates, or has incidences of violence in the hallways, that has poor academic outcomes, or any school that has low attendance. If we put trained coaches in there and we bring in some evaluators and researchers, and we look at whether or not having sports programs revived in these kinds of school atmospheres changes the commitment of kids to school, their academic performance, their attendance, which is what the principals are so worried about, their matriculation into high school. If we can prove that, Mark, then we now have an economic argument, which is all the money we're dumping in public education and seeing the same results. Maybe we need to do it differently. And maybe by reviving sports, you can actually see a greater percentage of your kids coming to school, feeling committed, and drawing up a plan for themselves to go to high school and go to college. I know it's true because I have those examples in my program every day, but I haven't done the study yet to show the legal argument, the policy argument to school districts across America that this activity that sometimes you think, is an afterthought from an education perspective may actually be the core of education performance, being an athlete.
Well, it's humbling to me because I think I do a lot, but I don't think I'm doing anything close to that. But so the idealistic version, which hopefully you're going to prove to be true, still gets tainted, spoiled. The water gets poisoned by the outside influences, teachers that don't believe, parents, bad characters in the amateur athletic world, recruiting for private schools, recruiting for travel teams, those type of things. There's lots of negative influences. But I want to focus on the parents. Do you have any programs to help educate parents about what you're doing and why you're doing it?
So one thing about our program is we are working in communities where parents often have they're working hard, they have multiple jobs, they're keeping their family together. So their time is an issue, but time is an issue for all parents, I think. So while I point that out, I don't think that that's the answer here. We do try and engage the parents in conversations, in starting clubs around the teams. And and to the extent that we can get that involvement, it's really, really important because when if they can come to a coach training and see how we're training their coaches, it kind of turns them into advocates for the type of approach that we have, which is like, wow, that coach is going to be a positive influence on my kid's life. And I think a lot of parents send their kid to a sports program and they don't realize that their kid may be, spend more time with that soccer coach than they are with their physics or their English teacher. And yet they know very little about that coach and whether or not that coach has been trained and whether that coach deserves all the attention that they're about to get from their kids. And I think that training is just so essential when we get parents engaged to say, this isn't just a coach who's going to teach baseball here. This is a coach who's trained to talk about your kid, encourage them to use their baseball skills in life. And that's how we try and get the parents to see the difference we're making.
Great. It's amazing. Final line of questioning. How do you locate your coaches, identify them, and secondly, how do you train them?
So a lot of programs are based on let's recruit young adults a lot of volunteer programs and service programs. Let's recruit young adults from here to go and work here, which this tends to be maybe a place with more resource, and this tends to be an underserved community. And it's good. I mean, because we need exchanges of all kinds as people, and we need those experiences on both sides, exposure. But we did our program different because, when we looked at, the equity issues of sports and also of service, of national service, why aren't we really making a focused, intentional effort to recruit national service members from the same communities they serve? Why have we sort of settled in a model that this person more resourced is always, is easier to recruit to come into this community than someone from that community? And I think the reason we haven't done it in a lot of programs is it's just easy, to just find a bunch of college graduates from Columbia to go and coach in Harlem. But that's not what we did. We really intentionally said, wait, we're in Brownsville, Brooklyn, Liberty City, Miami, Watson, LA, Roxbury, Boston, Inglewood, Chicago. Who are the young adults who played sports in these communities? And would they like to step up and receive a stipend from us to be a coach? Because not only will we give them the opportunity to be a coach, but they'll become a leader of their own community. And the kids who are on their teams will say, this coach looks like me. This coach knows the same church I go to, knows my kindergarten teacher. I really listen to this coach. And if we then go to the second half of your question, if I've got that kid listening, then what is that coach saying? And that's where the training comes in. The training is a year-round course. We've started offering it to coaches all over the country because once we place coaches, a lot of times the school or the park says, wow, that coach's philosophy is slightly different than everyone. And the kids seem to gravitate around that coach. So then they call us up and say, can you train all our coaches? And so the training really, Mark, if I was to summarize it, it's first about building a culture, because every sports team is a culture. And it's a culture as powerful as anything out there. And I can say, working communities with very active gangs, our sports team culture competes with all of them in terms of belonging, in terms of attachment, in terms of leadership, but it's a positive culture. And so how do you build that and ensure that? Because that will keep kids coming if they're part of something that they feel belonging to. Then when you build that culture, how do you build relationships intentionally? Because we're all part of this, but what does it mean to be an athlete on this team? Not just on this field or this court or this diamond, but also when we're off these playing areas. And how do we support each other? How do we have each other's back? And so building relationships between the kids and the coach, using, as I mentioned earlier, parts of the practice to sit down with the kids, team time, and learn about their stories. And then the third part of our training is, now that you learn kids' stories, you may encounter kids who are having challenges. And, guess what, America, coaches are the #1 front line for mental health in a country that has a mental health crisis. The #1 people who see it, they are our coaches. They see it before the teachers and sometimes before the parents. They see, if they can sit down and hear a story, they see that kid is responding rather too aggressively for that particular, even on the court, like something's going on with that level of aggression. So how do I know the story of my players too? And how do I use that to sort of address stress and trauma and things like that a kid may, not all athletes, but some athletes may be going through? And you can address it. You can ask them about their story. You can encourage them. And so that's our training, is let's talk about a big culture. Let's talk about positive relationships. Let's talk about navigating kids who you might see have a challenge, and you may be the last, they drop out of your sports team. They may drop out of school and drop out of life. So that's it. We train 22 hours throughout the year. Our coaches end up, I would say, 2/3 of them either come back or go and get jobs in the nonprofits and the schools and parks they're working in. So nice. It's a really wonderful pathway for young adults in communities across this country.
Well, it's a drop the mic moment, Paul. You did a great job describing that, and I appreciate you sharing. People want to learn more about your program. People want to contact you, hopefully donate to what you do. Where can we find you? Up2Us Sports.
Up2ussports.org. Info at up2ussports.org is a general. We're always checking that mailbox, and just check out our website. All the information's there.
Great. Paul, you've been an absolute wonder to talk to, and very informative. I applaud what you're doing. I think it's great. The second principle of our business is using athletics to better the lives of the people around us. I don't know if I've met anyone doing a better job at that than you. So congratulations, and thank you for being on the podcast.
Thanks a lot, Mark.